Welcome to the Space for Diplomacy podcast by Spaceport Sarabhai, India's space policy think tank. I'm your host, Susmita Mohanty. This podcast series features conversations on far-ranging topics such as geopolitics, tech diplomacy, international cooperation, and all things space. In episode 1, I will be talking to Ambassador Rakesh Sood about issues such as space and nuclear technology, non-proliferation and export controls. Ambassador Sood, welcome to the Space for Diplomacy podcast.
Thank you, Susmita. I'm delighted to join you for the first session of your new podcast.
A quick introduction. Ambassador Sood is a particle physicist turned diplomat. He joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1976. He has served in Indian missions in Brussels, Dakar, Geneva, and Islamabad in various capacities, and as Deputy Chief of Mission in Washington, D.C. He has served as India's first ambassador and permanent representative to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, and later as ambassador to Afghanistan, Nepal, and France. After retiring in 2013, Ambassador Sood served as a special envoy of the Prime Minister for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation for a year. So, Ambassador Sood, you have helped set up the Disarmament and International Security Affairs, or what we call DISA, a division in India's Ministry of External Affairs. What is the role of DISA, and how has the global threat portfolio evolved since World War II until the present moment?
Sushmita, when I came back from Pakistan, which was 1992, early 1992, we were looking at a very different world that had existed earlier. A couple of things had happened. The Berlin Wall had come down. Germany had been unified. Soviet Union disintegrated. India had established full diplomatic relations with Israel by exchanging ambassadors. A year later, Prime Minister Narasimha Rao would announce his Look East policy, beginning our engagement with Southeast Asia, the ASEAN Regional Forum. It is this kind of context that we are looking at. And it is what we had in terms of DISA's predecessor was a UN disarmament section, where all disarmament-related work basically took place within the UN framework, which means the General Assembly, the Conference on Disarmament, and to an extent in Vienna, where the IAEA was located, and also the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, COPUOS. Now what happened was we had to engage with other countries, primarily the United States, on issues pertaining to our security, because that had been decided by Prime Minister Narasimha Rao and President Bush Sr. in 1992, when they met and agreed with each other that since during the Cold War, very often we had been on different sides of the table, perhaps we should engage with each other on some of these issues in order to redefine our relationship. So within 6 months, I quickly realized two things. One, we had never really engaged with any country in terms of our security perceptions and so on. And two, that in the rest of the world, the growing threat perception was proliferation, and the growing preoccupation was tightening non-proliferation export control. So gradually, more and more dual-use technologies were being brought under export controls, which were these ad hoc export control regimes, which, because we were not members of any of these, which were going to tighten our access to dual-use equipment, technologies, and so on. And this was the origin. So Prime Minister Narasimha Rao approved the creation of something called an eminent persons group, in which we had various current and former heads of the Atomic Energy Administration, Space Administration, as well as the DRDO. And to sensitize the scientific community as to what was happening in geopolitical terms, what were our compulsions. NEA took the lead, and that is how what was UN disarmament got converted into Disarmament and International Security Affairs Division. By the end of 1992, we had set up this division. We also brought in people from the armed services on deposition, as also a scientist from DRDO, to help us have the necessary ability to take care of some of the technical aspects and the military aspect of our work.
So, if you look at the global threat portfolio, Ambassador, could you lay it out for us since 1992 until where we are today, geopolitically speaking?
You know, in 1992, within our neighborhood, things started changing. You know, this was the time when troubles in Kashmir began with a renewed intensity. As I mentioned, Soviet Union had collapsed, and this happened after 10 years of a kind of a jihad that had been supported by the CIA and the ISI against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. Now, Pakistan had this ready-made tool, as it were, and it now used those schools for the Mujahideen to train Kashmiri militants and infiltrate them across the line of control. We had our own domestic issues in Kashmir at that time. And as a result, there was an uptick in violence in Jammu and Kashmir, leading India and Pakistan to establish for the first time a sustained dialogue on confidence building measures. In 1993, we signed our first confidence building agreement with China, with whom we had started our dialogue after Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's visit in 1988. A lot of this work was carried out in DISA division in terms of our dialogues with our neighbors as well. If we look at it fast forward, this was also a time when negotiations began in Geneva. As I mentioned, it was a unipolar moment with the US being the leading or the sole superpower. China and Russia supported the US willy-nilly, as it were. France and Britain went along. Among the new negotiations that began was the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty negotiations in Geneva. India, as a member of the Conference on Disarmament, took part in these negotiations. Throughout this period, we continued our exchanges with the United States on arms control, non-proliferation issues, and so on. Then came a decision point for us that forced us to withdraw from the CTBT negotiations. This was followed 2 years later by the tests that were undertaken by India. That changed the relationship with the United States because the US came down heavily on us and led to a very intense set of exchanges or dialogues between India and the United States. That was followed by the 9/11, which changed global threat perceptions about terrorism and raised new concerns about terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. From then on, we have seen continuous evolution in terms of India's own stand on many of these issues and India's relationship with the main power.
Right. So it looks like over that decade, starting 92, we moved from a focus on nuclear non-proliferation to terrorism and WMDs. Can we just go back in time a bit? So the NPT was signed in 1968. And in 1966, 2 years prior to the signing of the NPT by the world nuclear powers then, India announced that it could produce nuclear weapons within 18 months. Is there a backstory to the timing of that announcement?
Well, the backstory is to an extent that in 1962, India and China had a conflict on the border areas. India came out as a loser in that conflict. In 1964, China went nuclear. That raised certain security concerns insofar as India was concerned. Pandit Nehru had passed away. Lal Bahadur Shastri had taken over as the Prime Minister. And at that time, the Department of Atomic Energy also developed the capability or set up its first reprocessing plant, which meant that we could reprocess spent fuel to extract plutonium from it. That is the time when Dr. Bhabha got permission from Lal Bahadur Shastri in 1965 to be able to conduct what was called a subterranean nuclear explosion experiment. However, there was no timeline that was fixed because we were also having technical issues with our reprocessing plant. And then, of course, things changed because in January of 1966, first Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri died suddenly while in Tashkent, where he was negotiating a ceasefire with Pakistan, which was being brokered by the Soviet Union at that time. And barely 2 weeks later in January, Dr. Bhabha died in the air crash over Mont Blanc. So that kind of pushed the whole thing into the background. So whether we were in a position to produce nuclear weapons, I would think is probably a correlation. We had started reprocessing. So theoretically, once we had accumulated sufficient quantities of plutonium, perhaps we could have put it together in the form of a device. Remember, even in 1974, we didn't test a bomb. We tested a nuclear explosive device.
Coming back to the NPT, what are India's major gripes with the NPT?
Well, the NPT negotiations began in 1965. The negotiations were triggered, I would think, by two major developments. One was the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the US and the Soviet Union came closest to a nuclear exchange, a full-fledged nuclear exchange. Now that many of the documents have been declassified of that Cuban Missile Crisis, it is clear both sides were operating in a kind of zone of, if not darkness, at least a gray zone. To this realization led the Soviet and American leadership to two conclusions. One, that the US and Soviet Union needed to have some communication channels, some arms control, some kind of way of managing their nuclear relationship, while accepting the fact that they were ideological rivals and nuclear superpowers. So that is what led to the growth of bilateral arms control agreements and communication channels like hotlines and nuclear risk reduction centers between the two countries spread out over the next 3 decades. The second realization that we came to was that nuclear weapons are pretty dangerous. And the more we control its proliferation, the less the number of countries that have it, the safer the world will be. And so they came together to launch what was the non-proliferation negotiation. And the target in the NPT at that time, mind you, was not countries like India or Brazil or something like that. It was very much their own ally, like West Germany, like Japan, which had been the victim of a nuclear attack, like Poland, like East Germany, like Italy, and so on. So these were possibly considered at that time countries that could also go nuclear. And obviously, neither the US nor the Soviet Union wanted more nuclear weapon states in its backyard. Soviet Union had already cut back on its nuclear cooperation with China, which it had begun in the late 50s. Now, when it began, it was like a three-legged stool. There were three components to the NPT. One was non-proliferation, namely that countries that don't have nuclear weapons would not acquire nuclear weapons. And second, countries that had nuclear weapons, and at that time there were 5, those countries would undertake negotiations towards nuclear disarmament, eliminating their own nuclear weapons. And third, that countries that gave up the right to have nuclear weapons would not be deprived of international cooperation leading to civilian applications of nuclear science and technology. In other words, there would be international cooperation mechanisms that would be developed through the IAEA, which would enable them to have the same benefits of nuclear science and technology as those countries that had taken the weapons route. Now, as the negotiations progressed, it became quite clear that the non-proliferation leg of the stool was the dominant one, and the disarmament leg of the stool was a pretty weak and a wobbly kind of a leg, because there was no specific time frames or commitments with regard to milestones and things like that that were put down in terms of how the disarmament negotiations are going to take place. And which is why it led to have an internal debate in India. We've already talked about our concerns with regard to 1962 China conflict with China and the fact that in 1964 China had gone nuclear. So our security concerns, coupled with the fact that the NPT did not emerge as a balanced kind of a treaty, led to a domestic debate where we then decided that we would not be able to join the treaty, and we, based on a debate in Parliament, government took the decision that we would not sign this treaty.
So has the NPT reached the limits of its success now that it's been several decades since? What are your views on that?
Well, NPT, in my view, I've always said, has reached the limits of its success by 1995. And the reason is that NPT got off to a slow start. There were about 45 countries that had signed on to it by 1970 when it entered into force. Since that time, it remained somewhat marginal growth in its number of states parties. But then once the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War was over, there was a massive effort put in by the 5 nuclear weapon states, collectively and individually, to get all the countries that had been outside the NPT to come into the NPT. For example, Soviet Union breaking up into 16 different countries. Now, obviously, Russia as the successor state did not want nuclear weapon states on its neighborhood. So US and Russia cooperated very strongly to ensure that all the countries, 3 of them had specific nuclear capabilities, as we now know, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Belarus. And they were denuclearized and brought into the NPT. Similarly, you had Argentina and Brazil in Latin America, who had remained outside the NPT. They were brought in. And a host of other countries in Africa. South Africa, which had not been a party to the NPT, had developed under the white apartheid regime nuclear weapons, was persuaded to hand over its nuclear weapons before a majority black rule was introduced in South Africa, and joined the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state. So one reason why this had become important was that in 1995, the NPT had to come up for a major decision, which was what is going to be its future. The original NPT was a treaty designed for 25 years with the provision that after 25 years, a decision would be taken as to whether it should be rolled over for another 25 or terminated or extended indefinitely. Now, obviously, the major powers, namely the P5 powers or the N5 powers, if we want to call them that, wanted the NPT to be extended indefinitely and unconditionally. So in 1995, there was a major debate at the review conference because many of the countries wanted the disarmament leg of the NPT. However, there was no agreement on it, and eventually the NPT was extended indefinitely and unconditionally. By this time, the vast majority of the countries were all party to the NPT. And that is why I do believe that it kind of reached the limits of its success. It is also evident today from the fact that there are only 4 countries outside the NPT, which is India, Pakistan, and Israel, which never joined the NPT, and all 3 have nuclear weapons. And North Korea, which joined the NPT and then withdrew from the NPT to pursue a nuclear weapons program. And the NPT cannot really accommodate these four countries in any fashion because the NPT only recognizes 5 nuclear weapon states.
So you said it's now been extended indefinitely and unconditionally by the N5. That's problematic. Are there any lessons from nuclear non-proliferation for space?
There are, because what happened was that outer space started out in the UN framework with the acceptance of the principles of being a global commons. And the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 highlights that very clearly. However, space is now becoming increasingly contested with more and more players getting into the space domain. And space is, in a sense, already a militarized domain, and according to some commentators, may also be a weaponized domain. So, therefore, there are questions being asked about the validity or questions being asked as to how effective has the Outer Space Treaty been. And today, what we are seeing in the realm of space is actually two separate initiatives. One is the US-led Artemis Accords initiative, and the other is the Russia-China-led initiative on an international lunar station. So this basically reflects the growing rivalries in geopolitical terms and the fact that space is becoming an increasingly sensitive area in any future conflict because of a whole host of space-based technologies that have become relevant.
In fact, a lot of countries have created space defense departments from scratch. India now has integrated space into its defense thinking, and they've created a separate department. I believe Australia has too. The United States has a space force. So clearly, space is militarizing in ways that hadn't happened. There had been a period of peace, so to speak, for at least a few decades. And we're going back to militarization of space. So now let's come back to the nuclear realm again and talk a bit about India's nuclear test. India conducted its first nuclear test, Operation Smiling Buddha, in May of 1974, and its second test in May of 1998, called Operation Shakti. What did you think of the American response to India's nuclear tests, both the one in 74 and 98? And how did it impact our space and nuclear programs?
If we look at the 1974 test, now that was a bit of a jolt to the international community, particularly the United States, because the US had cooperated with India quite a lot during the 50s and 60s in our nuclear program. In fact, the US had helped set up our first nuclear research reactor in the early 1950s. The first nuclear power plants, Tarapur Atomic Power Station, was set up with the help of the United States and had gone critical in 1969. So the US, although we had not signed the NPT and we were not violating any international law or any such thing, and we also further, in 1974, we declared that it was a peaceful nuclear explosion. Now, PNEs were a permitted activity even under the NPT. But everybody knows that PNEs and bomb, there is a very thin dividing line. And to be able to convert an explosive device into a deliverable bomb is a question of engineering and not a question really of so much of physics, because the physics had already been mastered. So the US and many of the other countries came together and felt that this peaceful cooperation for civilian applications of nuclear science and technology was something that needed to be controlled much more. And that led to the establishment of the London Club, which evolved into the Nuclear Suppliers Group, which started putting certain export controls on technologies like reprocessing and enrichment and heavy water and things like that. So that was the reaction then. And what it meant was that civilian cooperation that we had enjoyed so far with many of the countries, including the US, Canada, France, Soviet Union, it all ended because they were all now party to the nuclear suppliers group, and we were deprived of that. So we ended up working on our own. We converted the program into a completely indigenous program. 1998, the reaction that the US had was a much more severe reaction. Mind you, as I explained earlier, this was a unipolar moment. US was the sole superpower. The US had led the negotiations for a comprehensive test ban treaty, and that treaty had been opened for signature in 1996. We had participated in the negotiations, but then had withdrawn from the negotiations in 1996 and said that we will not be able to join this treaty, leading to a certain amount of unhappiness on the part of the United States. At the same time, we had also seen the indefinite extension, and there again, the US had played a leading role in getting the NPT extended indefinitely. Now, under those circumstances, when we tested in 1998, and again, it took the world by surprise, the US came down very, very heavily because it felt that we had gone against the kind of a norm that they had been trying to build. And the concern was that this may lead to other countries testing. It did lead to our neighbor testing within weeks of our tests. And subsequently, of course, it led to North Korea also testing. Both the provocations for that were quite different. And the US then led the international condemnation of our tests. The UN Security Council passed a resolution urging us to give up nuclear weapons. Because remember, what we announced, what Prime Minister Vajpayee announced, was not just the test, but he also declared in Parliament India was now a nuclear weapons state, something which we had not done in 1974. After the 1974 test, we had said that it was a peaceful nuclear explosion. This time, that ambiguity was dropped. And it became clear that India saw itself as a responsible nuclear weapons state. And therefore, it began to articulate its doctrine in that fashion.
And that did impact India's space program. If I remember correctly, we were trying to acquire cryogenic technology for our bigger rocket, the GSLV, from the Russians. And do you recall if that complicated India's move towards not only acquiring cryogenic technology, but also eventually indigenously developing it for the GSLV rocket?
Absolutely. We had the cryogenic deal was with Glav Cosmos and ISRO, was between Glav Cosmos and ISRO. And this had already been frowned upon by the United States. I think it is useful to remember that there was the missile technology control regime that had already come into existence at that time. Now, Russia or Soviet Union, when the MTCR came into existence, was not a party to the regime. Soviet Union was not a member of the MTCR. So in that sense, Soviet Union was not obliged not to transfer a cryogenic engine to India. However, the export control regimes have third country jurisdictions in the sense that if America feels that country X, say in this case Russia, is doing something which its own companies are forbidden from doing, then they will impose sanctions on Russia. And so that is how both in 1992, both Glav Cosmos and ISRO came under American sanctions for the cryogenic rocket deal. And after 1998, America further tightened more and more dual-use technology export controls on India's space capabilities, as well as, of course, the nuclear capabilities.
So given US's historical role as a leading arms exporter and the only nation to have used nuclear weapons, How does it justify imposing technology sanctions on countries like India? And do you believe such measures bolster its non-proliferation stance, or do they undermine its moral authority?
I think we have to look at it in a certain time frame. All countries would like to take a lead. They would like to say that, all right, if I am leading in a particular technology, then I would like to retain that kind of a lead. Now, the US has been a major power and has played a leading role for, I would say, the last nearly 100 years or so, since World War One. And as long as this kind of a non-proliferation approach or technology control approach was something that was shared with other major powers, let's say during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, it could be practiced more successfully. However, it is important to note that every technology matures. Nuclear technology is no longer seen as a revolutionary technology as it was, let us say, in 1940s and 50s. At that time, it was seen as a completely new technology. A lot of people would have seen Oppenheimer, I'm sure. And you get a sense of the wonderment on the part of the scientists when they carried out the Trinity test, the first test in 1945. Nobody knew whether it would work or it won't work and things like that. So the same was true of the space race at that point in time. How many countries had satellites and how many countries had launch capabilities? And even among the countries that did have these capabilities, it was all under government control. So what has happened is today, these technologies have become relatively mature technologies. Today, space launch capabilities exist in the private sector. In fact, the private sector today undertakes many more space launches compared to governments. Nuclear technology is today a 75-year-old technology. So as technologies mature, merely relying on export controls is not enough. Today, there are a number of countries that have the scientific and the engineering skills to go nuclear if they wanted to, but they don't because they don't think it is in their security interests. India chose to go down the nuclear road because we felt our security needs demanded it. We knew by 1998 that Pakistan had already gone nuclear with its clandestine cooperation relationship with China, and that the Pakistani device had not been tested in Pakistan before 1998, but had actually been carried to China and had been tested at the Lucknow site with Pakistani scientists. So we found that we had two adversaries, one on the north, one on the west, both of them in close contact and close cooperation with each other, and both adversaries were nuclear armed. So we felt that our security requirements demanded that go nuclear. And that's what led us down that road. There are many other countries who have the capability but don't have the geopolitical compulsion to go nuclear. So I would say that depends on your circumstances. And to an extent, the non-proliferation approach is something that does help to control the technologies, especially because you don't want these technologies to fall into hands of non-state actors or terrorist groups or things like that. And for that, you do need to have certain kinds of export controls. And we, therefore, as part of our role as a responsible nuclear weapon state, do follow these export controls and have introduced them gradually within our own country.
You also served as ambassador to France, which is one of the N5 countries. And since the early 60s, France and India have collaborated in space-related endeavors, pretty much as equal partners, if I may say. And I recall in 1998, when India conducted second nuclear tests, the French response was different from the American response. Do you recall how France responded to that test?
Yes. In 1998, January, President Chirac was chief guest at India's Republic Day. He talked of India as an emerging power which had to be treated as such. The reason was that geopolitically, France has always wanted to have a slightly more autonomous approach, even though it is a member of NATO and a member of EU and all of that, and part of the Western bloc, loosely speaking. But it has always sought to have its own autonomy. That is the reason France also went nuclear, because it felt that it needed to have its own nuclear deterrent. And so it decided to carry out the nuclear tests. And originally, when General de Gaulle, who was the president of France at that time, he made it clear that French nuclear deterrent would be purely for French security. Now, of course, President Macron has made other statements saying that we are ready to contribute or make this part of the European deterrent, which is discussions which have yet to take place. So France had always had more of an autonomous trait in its foreign policy, and somehow was therefore intellectually and ideologically similar to that of India and more sympathetic and understanding of India's compulsions. France also has overseas territories in the Indian Ocean, and so probably it has a better feel for it. And third, the French at that time were a bit uncomfortable with the idea of US as the sole superpower. In fact, it was the French foreign minister at that time, Hubert Védrine, who described the United States as the word he used was a hyperpower, a hyperpuissance, which was more of a derogatory. It was like, a big fellow who doesn't have any other adversary, who's just in a boxing ring going around looking for whoever he can punch. So when President Chirac came here in January of 1998 and made this speech about recognizing India, talking about a multipolar world, about India's responsible record as a country with advanced nuclear technologies, it was something that was reassuring. And after 1998 tests, the French, their discussions with us were entirely consistent with this approach. So the French, though they joined the United States and the Security Council resolution that condemned India's tests, in our discussions with them, private discussions, which began by end of May 1998, President Chirac received us and began a strategic dialogue. And I had the privilege of being part of that Indian delegation. The French were far, far more understanding of our security concerns, but we also realized that till we developed a certain degree of trust with the United States, their ability to change the global perception was limited. And so we also, in parallel, developed a very strong dialogue between then Foreign Minister Jaswant Singh and Deputy Secretary of State Stroke Talbot to lay the foundations of what has become a fairly robust India-US relationship.
So speaking of changing global perception, I hear that there have been calls to now include India even in the nuclear suppliers group, which is the pragmatic thing to do, if you ask me. How have the global perceptions about India being a nuclear weapon state changed once India signed the MTCR in 2016?
Well, India could have been a member of the nuclear suppliers group even earlier, but what happened is that China is a member of the nuclear suppliers group. China is not a member of any of the other export control regimes like MTCR or Wassenaar Arrangement or the Australia group. So to admit a new member, all existing members have to agree. In other words, each of the existing members has a veto. Now, the fact that India had already, This had been announced by India that we would eventually join all the export control regimes as we brought our own export controls into harmony with those provisions. And gradually this started happening. So we had become members of the Australia group, of the MTCR, of the Wassenaar arrangement. The nuclear suppliers group was the only one. We knew that it would be a little tougher because of the Chinese position. And when China had changed over the years, China's position has evolved, let's say, from when we began talking to China in 1988 to our confidence building measures and agreements that concluded in the 1990s and so on. So by the time we come around to the previous decade, we find that it is a much more capable and a much more assertive China. And there is also a growing geopolitical rivalry that is emerging between the United States and China. And China sees India very much as in the US camp. And there are also strains that are emerging in the India-China relationship. And so therefore, when we sort of formally pressed our NSG membership claim, I think it was at the NSG plenary in South Korea in Seoul, that China did not exactly cast a veto on it, but basically in an oblique fashion, put it in the cold storage saying India is not a member of the NPT. All other NSG members are members of the NPT. NSG needs to evolve a policy on how non-members of the NPT should be brought into the NSG, because we also have a similar request from Pakistan. Nobody wanted Pakistan in the NPT, given the background of A.Q. Khan and all the rest of it. That basically put paid to any hopes of India becoming a member of the NSG. It doesn't change much because in 2008, China had reluctantly acquiesced into providing a waiver from the NSG regulations to permit civilian nuclear cooperation with India. So in a sense, there is a tacit acceptance of India's position as a country that has nuclear weapons, that is not a member of the NPT, but because of its record upholding non-proliferation and having systems of export controls in place, that it was relevant to exempt India from that rule and create a waiver that India and other NSG members could have civilian nuclear cooperation as long as it was under safeguards. That meant that we could continue with our nuclear weapons program. Obviously, that is not something for which we need somebody else's cooperation or anything like that, nor is any other country likely to cooperate on that front. But for our civilian nuclear power program, we now have agreements with about 16 or 17 countries to permit that. So in a sense, that waiver demonstrates the unique position that India has in the nuclear domain, irrespective of the fact that it is not yet a full member of the NSG, though we observe the same restrictions.
So now that we are talking about China, I'd like us to take a look at the world nuclear arsenal to understand how nuclear deterrence works in the Asian context. So China has about 600 or so warheads and is projected to exceed 1,000 warheads by about 2030, is what research tells me. And by contrast, the United States and Russia have about 5,000, give or take, warheads each. India, we haven't given any open declaration to this effect, but it's estimated to have about 180 or so nuclear warheads. And Pakistan, again, these are estimations, it has around 170 warheads. So could you tell us, how does nuclear deterrence work in our neighborhood?
The first thing about nuclear deterrence is, what is your threat perception? What is the role that you want nuclear weapons to play in addressing your threat perceptions? then you have to look deeper a little bit into your doctrine and so on. Now, our doctrine is different from a lot of other countries. It has certain similarities, actually, with China or China of the past. Let me make that clear. Whereas the US and Soviet Union, for example, during the Cold War, even as they engaged in arms control, developed arsenals that at one time the two of them had something like more than 65,000 nuclear bombs put together. Just the two of them. Why they went into this inordinately useless, expensive nuclear arms race? Because they saw themselves as having global responsibilities. They felt they had nuclear umbrellas over their respective military allies and all the rest of it, and things like that. But as I said, if we come back to basics, what is India's doctrine? India's doctrine is that we don't want to get into a nuclear arms race. What we need is credible but a minimalistic deterrent force. Now, that means that it must be survivable, because we must be, in order for our deterrence to be credible, our nuclear weapons must be able to survive, and we must still be able to retaliate, because we also, as a sign of being a responsible nuclear weapon state, believe in a no first use, which means we will not be the first to use nuclear weapons. In other words, we are conveying a message that our nuclear weapons are not war-fighting weapons. They're not meant for fighting wars. I mean, it's not like any other bomb. I think underlying all this is also a sense that India is a large country. We do not have territorial expansionist ambitions that we want to go and occupy some other country. Yes, we have territorial disputes. We would like to settle those disputes through negotiations, but we don't foresee any existential threat to India. Nobody can eliminate the existence of India as a nation. So therefore, we are comfortable and confident that our nuclear doctrine or our nuclear posture is something that reflects a sense of responsibility. It is consistent with our historical, civilizational vision of India. China felt pretty much like the same way during the 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on. China was confident that it's a huge country, it's a civilizational ethos, etc., and it didn't want to get into any kind of a nuclear arms race. But as its rivalry with the United States has grown, it has realized and it has started modifying its arsenal. Originally, about 25 years ago, it began with the idea that, look, they also have a no first use. And so it began with the idea that how do we ensure the survivability of our nuclear deterrent? And in order to make it survivable, they started putting their capabilities underground. They started making them mobile on rail tracks and things like that. Then they started developing more and more of multiple warheads on each missile. They went into hypersonics, because what was happening was that on the US side, they were developing certain conventional global precision strike capabilities. They were developing missile defense capabilities and so on. And so Chinese started moving in that direction. Then as the rivalry sharpened further, they decided that they needed to also expand and perhaps attribute other roles to their nuclear arsenal. And that is what we are seeing. So currently there is a debate in China about whether they should continue with the no first use or not. For us, the other adversary is Pakistan. Now, for right or wrong, Pakistan has convinced itself that India poses an existential threat to Pakistan. And so therefore, Pakistan says that we cannot give a no first use assurance, and that our nuclear weapons are designed to cater to all possible threats, and that we can use nuclear weapons to deter a small attack or a large attack or whatever it is. We find that very irresponsible kind of an approach. So if you look at the Indo-Pacific now, you have US allies like Japan, South Korea, and Philippines. You have certain US government assurances, though it is not an ally, vis-a-vis Taiwan. And we also know China's goal of integrating Taiwan into its one China policy or one China vision, as it is. Taiwan has a democratic system and certainly does not want to be a part of China. So how these things evolve, particularly now with the Trump government in Washington, and what do US allies, how credible do they think is the US nuclear umbrella? Because so far, the US has always assured China its security allies like Philippines, Japan, South Korea, and if you look further afield, Australia and New Zealand, that its nuclear umbrella covers all of them, that it is prepared to use nuclear weapons if need be for the defense and security of its allies and partners. Now, President Trump believes that he's the best deal maker, and if he feels that he can do a deal with China, now, we've seen what happened with Ukraine. Basically, compared to the previous administration, he has thrown Ukraine under the bus. And were that to happen, how would other US allies in the region respond? Because China has territorial disagreements in East China Seas with Japan, and of course, Taiwan certainly. And it also has our own, we have boundary disputes, but that is a different matter altogether, since we are a nuclear weapon state. But China does not see India as an existential threat. And in fact, nor do we see China as an existential threat. And that is why perhaps even in 2020, when relations in India and China took a nosedive after the Galwan tragedy, the nuclear card has never been used by either country. Because how we look at nuclear deterrence operating depends on what our perceptions are. So I guess in the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific, if you want to call it that way, we don't know because the situation is now evolving. I mean, the situation had been a certain kind of way for the last 50, 60 years. But in the last 5, 6 years, as China has started reassessing the role of nuclear weapons in its own calculus, and now with Trump there, I think there is a lot of churn that is taking place in terms of looking at the nuclear deterrence equations in the Indo-Pacific region.
So now that we are talking about this evolving world order under President Trump's second term, let's refocus closer to home. A month after President Trump began his second term, Prime Minister Modi met him in Washington, D.C. Several things were discussed. India agreed to amend its Atomic Energy Act and Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Act to address liability concerns by U.S. companies that want to engage with India on the civilian front. The two leaders announced their commitment to operationalize the U.S.-India Civil Nuclear Agreement of 2007. And I believe now they are talking about plans to build American-designed nuclear reactors in India through large-scale localization and possibly technology transfer. So how do you envision this civilian nuclear cooperation with the U.S. going forward? And why did U.S. swing from being a technology denier regime, as far as India is concerned, restricting nuclear trade, to civil nuclear cooperation with us? Why this tectonic shift in U.S. foreign policy?
When the US policy had shifted in 2007, 2008, after all, it is only after we were able to sign the bilateral agreement with the United States that we also had the nuclear suppliers group waiver. And in our dialogues with France, with UK, with Russia, it was quite clear to us that till the US moved the goalpost, these countries alone would not be able to get us the NSG waiver, which finally happened in 2008. When the US shifted, because the US had come to accept by 2005, I would say, that India was a responsible country, that India had an ambitious civilian nuclear program. It was India's non-proliferation credentials were impeccable, and that India needed to brought into the nuclear framework while not accepting the fact that in a fashion under the NPT that it's a nuclear weapon state. But in all other aspects, India needed to be brought into the nuclear framework. And that was formalized in 2008 under the 123 agreement between India and the United States, the Civilian Nuclear Cooperation Agreement. Now, at that time, both GE and Westinghouse expressed an interest in setting up nuclear power plants in India. And their talks did take place between Department of Atomic Energy. However, what happened was that with the Fukushima nuclear disaster that took place, a lot of interest in large nuclear power plants just evaporated in the West. You remember a few years ago, Germany announced that they are not going to have any nuclear power on their territory and they were shutting down all nuclear plants. America itself has commissioned only one nuclear power plant in the last 30 years. So with that, Westinghouse hived off its nuclear reactor division. GE went into cooperation with, I think, Hitachi. Westinghouse went into cooperation with Toshiba and all of that kind of thing. So the agreements with America in terms of the nuclear power plants coming up in India, these were supposed to be large nuclear power plants, 1,000 megawatts, 1,200 megawatts, and 5 reactors, a bank of 5-6 reactors in one location. So a total unit capacity of something like 5,000, 6,000 megawatts, like the one that we are developing at Kudankulam with Russia. Now what has happened is that with concerns about climate change, but mind you, Trump is a non-believer in climate change, so I don't know. But overall, generally, global concerns about climate change, a lot of people think that small modular reactors, which is basically anywhere from 30, 35 megawatts to about 300 megawatts, are a viable solution if we can develop this technology and if it can be shown to be economical. So there are a number of designs that are being explored for small modular nuclear reactors. And US companies are also looking at it closely. There are at least 40 or 50 US companies that are looking at it. We ourselves have a large number of thermal power plants. And given the targets that we have announced of net zero by 2070, we are also considering a major expansion in our nuclear power capacity. What was announced in the budget was that we hope to get to 100 gigawatts. And currently, the installed capacity is 8.2 gigawatts. 8,180 megawatts is the current installed capacity. And if we had to get to 1,000 megawatts, but that's a huge investment that would be required. If we have to get this kind of investment, even from the private sector or from other countries, we need to have a much more credible legal system in place. We ourselves, when we passed our nuclear liability law in 2010, our own companies were extremely concerned because it was not very clear to them as to how they could be held liable in case there was an accident. Now, if other private players are going to come in, it leads to some complication. The second thing is NPCIL going to be the sole nuclear operator? If so, the design is going to be an American design or an American private company's design or a French private company's design. Then what is the responsibility in case of a mishap? The third question is, who certifies? Now, we don't have an atomic energy regulatory board, which is set up like, say, SEBI is by an act of parliament. The Atomic Energy Regulatory Board is supposedly autonomous, but it is still part of the Department of Atomic Energy. Most countries where they set up regulatory authorities, and even in India, you look at the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, it is not subservient to the Ministry of Telecom. Look at SEBI, Securities and Exchange Board of India. Now, this again has been set up through an independent act of the Indian Parliament in order to ensure that SEBI is independent, autonomous, and not under either the influence of Ministry of Finance or Ministry of Corporate Affairs. So we have had discussions as to whether the Atomic Energy Regulatory Board should be backed or should be constituted by virtue of a separate act of Indian Parliament. Because today, even though it is autonomous, it is a part of the Department of Atomic Energy. So I would say that in addition to the Atomic Energy Act of 1962, which puts the ownership of all nuclear materials and technologies as belonging to Government of India, the liability law, which has to clarify if NPCIL is getting designs from outside and private players are going to be investing in our nuclear power industry, and the regulatory aspects. These are three areas which will need to be clarified through broad-based discussion so that if India has to achieve its target of 100 gigawatts from its current low levels.
So finally, Ambassador Sood, I have a crystal ball question for you. What will the world look like, geopolitically speaking, in 2050?
One thing is clear, that the existing global order is under strain. The existing global order was set up after World War II. That is when the United Nations came into being. That is when the composition of the UN Security Council, or at least the 5 permanent members, was decided. It is quite clear that this is no longer working as it was intended. What the new global order will be is difficult to say, because any global order requires a convergence of views between the major powers of the day, and the major powers of 1945 are not necessarily the major powers of 2025. There are new major powers that have emerged, and they have to find a convergence in order to develop a worldview which reflects the new world order. And then it has to be presented to the rest of the world as something which is a greater global public good, which is how the UN came into being, and which is how, let us say, when we talk of the NPT, it came into being. Today, it is vital that we develop the outlines of a new world order, because conflict among major powers in a nuclearized world, certainly not something that anybody would want to contemplate.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Sood.
Thank you, Susmita. Thank you.
Thank you all for listening. Stay tuned for our next episode. Refer to our website, spaceportsarabhai.org, for more discussions, debates, dialogues, an explainer series, the new Space India podcast, and a newsletter about the progress of India's space program.